Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about bells or coffins or even death itself. This is a story about humanity's most primal terror, a fear so consuming it shaped medicine, religion, law, and invention for over 500 years. This is about the space between life and death, that thin gray line our ancestors could not define, could not measure, could not trust. And in that uncertainty, in that terrible doubt, they buried people alive. Not once, not twice, but thousands upon thousands of times, across continents, across centuries. The mistakes we're about to explore destroyed families. They haunted entire societies. They drove inventors to madness and doctors to despair. They filled churchyards with scratch marks on the underside of coffin lids. They inspired bells that never rang and windows that stared into eternal darkness. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know if you're drifting off to sleep in London at midnight, or watching the sunrise in Sydney, or fighting insomnia in Chicago at 3 in the morning. Phone away. Distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, death was simple. When breath left the body and the heart grew still, life departed. Our ancient ancestors, huddled around fires in caves, understood death as a visible transformation. The warmth fled. The body stiffened. Decay began its patient work. There was time to watch, time to know, time to be certain. But civilization brought complexity, and with complexity came doubt. In the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago, priests began to document something troubling. Sometimes the dead returned, not as spirits or phantoms, but as flesh and blood, waking from what seemed to be death itself. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1750 BCE, contains provisions for those who were presumed dead but awakened. Society had already learned that death could deceive. In ancient Egypt, the embalmers worked with absolute thoroughness, not merely to preserve the body for the afterlife, but to ensure that the deceased was truly deceased. The elaborate mummification process, which could take 70 days, served a dual purpose. Yes, it prepared the body for eternal life, but it also provided ample time for any spark of life to reveal itself. The extraction of organs, the treatment with natron salts, the careful wrapping, these were not just rituals, they were certainties. The ancient Greeks feared premature burial so intensely that they developed elaborate funeral customs designed to prevent it. The prothesis, the laying out of the body, lasted for an entire day. Family members maintained constant vigil. They watched for breath. They placed feathers near the nostrils to detect the slightest movement of air. They positioned mirrors before the mouth, looking for condensation. In Athens, by the 5th century BCE, law required that bodies remain unburied for 3 full days. Time itself became a tool of verification. Plato wrote of people falling into death-like trances, states so profound that even physicians could not detect life. These cataleptic seizures, as they would later be called, represented humanity's first documented encounter with conditions that mimicked death. In the Republic, Plato tells the story of a soldier who appeared to die on the battlefield. His body, showing no signs of decay, was placed upon a funeral pyre. Just as the flames were about to be lit, awakened and described visions of the afterlife. Was this mythology? Perhaps, but it reflected a very real anxiety that permeated Greek society. The Roman Empire inherited and amplified these fears. Roman law, codified in the 12 tables around 450 BCE, mandated that bodies could not be cremated or buried within city limits for 8 days. This was partially a public health measure, yes, but Roman medical texts reveal another motivation. Physicians like Celsus and Galen documented cases of apparent death, writing extensively about the challenges of determining when life had truly ended. They described patients who appeared lifeless but later revived, individuals who showed no pulse, no breath, no response to painful stimuli, yet who returned to consciousness hours or even days later. The Roman funeral procession itself became a prolonged ceremony of verification. The conclamatio, The ritual calling of the deceased's name 3 times served as a final test. Family members would lean close to the body and shout the person's name, listening for any response, any movement, any sign. Only after this threefold summons went unanswered would the funeral proceed. The prefiki, professional mourning women, were trained to watch for subtle signs of life while performing their wailing and lamentation. They were not merely actresses of grief. They were guards against premature burial. But it was in medieval Europe, in the shadow of the greatest catastrophe to ever befall Western civilization, that our story truly begins. It was here, in the plague years, that bells and death became forever intertwined. The first chapter of this story takes us to October of 1347. Genoese trading ships limped into the harbor of Messina, Sicily, carrying a cargo more deadly than anyone could imagine. The sailors aboard these vessels were dying, their bodies covered in grotesque black swellings, their skin marked with dark blotches that gave the pestilence its name, the Black Death. Within days, the disease had spread through Messina like wildfire through dry grass. Within weeks, it had consumed Sicily. Within months, it would devour Europe. The bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and carried by fleas on black rats, killed with terrifying speed. One day a person would feel a slight fever, a heaviness in the limbs. The next day, buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of eggs or apples, would erupt in the groin, the armpits, the neck. By the third day, the victim would be dead. Sometimes the progression was even faster. People went to bed healthy and were found dead in the morning. Others collapsed in the street and expired within hours. But the plague did something worse than kill quickly. It killed in ways that confused and deceived. Some victims fell into deep comas before death, their bodies cold and unresponsive, their breathing so shallow as to be imperceptible. In the chaos and terror of the pandemic, with dozens dying every day in even small towns, there was no time for careful examination, no time for the traditional vigils, no time for certainty. And so the bells began to ring. Church bells rung day and night, marking each new death, each new body carried to the church. These were not the gentle passing bells of earlier times, rung slowly and solemnly. These were urgent, constant, nearly maddening in their repetition. In Florence, according to the merchant Giovanni Villani, the bells rang so continuously that the city authorities ordered them stopped. The sound, he wrote, was driving the living mad with fear and despair. But there was another reason for the bells. In England, canon law required that bells be rung at the moment of death to ease the soul's passage to heaven. This was the passing bell, or soul bell, and its purpose was both spiritual and practical. Spiritually, it called the community to pray for the departing soul. Practically, it announced to the neighborhood that death had occurred and that a body would soon need burial. During the plague years, this system broke down entirely. People were dying too fast. There were too many souls, too few prayers, too much death for the bells to properly mark. Records from London show that in 1348 and 1349, more than 200 bodies per day were buried in emergency plague pits at East Smithfield. 200 bodies per day. In a city of perhaps 50,000 people, this meant 1 in every 60 households was touched by death each day. The parishes could not keep up. The gravediggers, called the Becchini in Italy and the Manati in Milan, worked around the clock. They wore bells attached to their ankles or around their necks to warn the living of their approach. These men, often criminals or the desperately poor, were simultaneously feared and essential. They alone would touch the plague dead. But in the chaos, mistakes happened. Inevitable, terrible mistakes. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in the Decameron just a few years after the Black Death swept through Florence, describes scenes of horror. He tells of people being buried alive, of families too terrified to properly examine their dead, of bodies thrown into mass graves while still breathing. So many died, he wrote, and of these very many expired in the public streets, day and night. A large number perished in their houses, and it was only by the stench of their decaying bodies that they proclaimed their death to their neighbors. In the village of Iam in Derbyshire, England, which would be struck by plague in 1665, the rector William Mompesson implemented strict protocols. Bodies were to be buried by family members in fields, not in churchyards. This was partially to prevent the spread of disease, but Mompesson had another concern, recorded in his letters. He had heard too many stories of people awakening in plague pits, screaming from beneath the earth, their cries muffled by soil and the bodies of others piled atop them. Medieval medical knowledge was primitive by modern standards. Physicians believed in the theory of humors, that the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that disease resulted from imbalance. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses. They could not explain why plague struck so suddenly or why it made victims appear dead while they still lived. But they observed, and they recorded, and they began to understand that death was not always what it seemed. The syndrome they called catalepsy became increasingly documented. Catalepsy, from the Greek meaning to seize down, was a condition characterized by muscular rigidity, fixed posture, and complete unresponsiveness to external stimuli. A cataleptic person appeared dead in every observable way. No apparent pulse, no visible breathing, cold skin, fixed, dilated pupils. In the Middle Ages, with no stethoscope, no blood pressure cuff, no EKG, no way to detect the faint heartbeat or minimal respiratory exchange, such a person would be declared dead. Medical texts from the 14th and 15th centuries describe numerous cases. A monk at Cluny Abbey who awakened on his bier just as the abbot began the funeral mass. A merchant's wife in Lubeck who revived in her coffin 2 days after burial, her screams heard by a gravedigger passing the churchyard at dawn. A young man in Paris who was discovered alive in a charnel house, having spent 3 days among corpses before regaining consciousness. These stories spread. They multiplied. They terrified. And they led to changes in how death was handled and confirmed. Moving into the Renaissance, as Europe slowly recovered from the devastation of the Black Death, societies began to formalize death verification procedures. In Italy, the Arte dei Medici, the guilds of physicians, established protocols. Before burial, a physician or surgeon had to examine the body and certify death. This certification included checks for breath using mirrors or feathers, assessment of body temperature, inspection of the eyes, and most importantly, waiting for the signs of decomposition. But Italy also developed another tradition, one born directly from plague experience: the waiting mortuary. These facilities, first established in the late 15th century and reaching their peak in the 18th and 19th centuries, provided a place where bodies could be observed for several days before burial. In Milan, Venice, and Rome, the deceased were laid out in specially designed halls, watched over by attendants whose sole purpose was to detect any sign of reviving life. The practice would spread to Germany, France, and eventually across Europe. But in the meantime, bells remained the primary alarm system for those who feared premature burial. Not the church bells rung at death, but bells attached to the graves themselves. The earliest documented grave bells appear in German lands in the late 16th century, simple ropes or chains connected to bells mounted on posts above graves. If the buried person awoke and moved, the theory went, the bell would ring and rescuers would come. The system was crude. The ropes rotted quickly. Animals disturbed the bells. Wind could cause false alarms. Rain and snow rendered everything useless. But the bells persisted because the fear persisted, and the fear persisted because the mistakes continued. In England, the Reformation brought changes to funeral customs. Henry VII's break with Rome in 1533 led to the dissolution of monasteries and the confiscation of church lands. The old Catholic rituals, including the elaborate funeral masses and extended vigils, were suppressed. Protestant theology emphasized simplicity and speed in burial. This had an unintended consequence. With less time spent watching and waiting, with fewer elaborate ceremonies during which life might reveal itself, the risk of premature burial increased. The English Civil War of the 1640s brought another wave of hasty burials. Battlefield casualties were often buried immediately, sometimes in mass graves, sometimes after only the most cursory examination. Parliamentary and royalist medical officers both documented cases of soldiers declared dead who later revived. Some awakened in carts being taken to burial pits. Others were discovered alive by gravediggers. A few, horrible to contemplate, left scratches on the inside of coffin lids, mute testimony to their final desperate hours. The Great Plague of London in 1665 brought the fear into sharp focus. London's population had grown to nearly 500,000 by this time, and when plague struck, it killed with medieval fury. The bills of mortality, weekly death tallies published by the parish clerks, record nearly 70,000 plague deaths in a single year. The actual number was likely much higher. Samuel Pepys, in his famous diary, describes the plague summer. Streets empty except for red crosses painted on the doors of infected houses. The constant rumble of death carts collecting bodies. The overwhelmed gravediggers working by torchlight in the Great Plague pits. And the rumors, persistent and terrifying, of people buried alive. One case particularly haunted London that summer. A woman named Margaret Blackwell collapsed in her home on July 15th. 2 parish searchers, women appointed to examine bodies and confirm plague death, declared her deceased. She was placed in a coffin and taken to the plague pit at Aldgate. But as the cart approached the pit, the driver heard a sound from the coffin. He stopped, opened the lid, and found Mrs. Blackwell conscious and attempting to push her way out. She had been in a coma, not dead. She recovered fully, but her case was far from unique. The parish records contain at least 12 similar instances that summer, and those are only the ones that were documented, the ones where someone heard or saw in time. But then something changed. Something worse than plague appeared on the horizon. A new understanding of death, or rather, a new confusion about death, that would turn the fear of premature burial into a full-blown cultural obsession that would last for the next 200 years. The second chapter reveals a transformation not just in medical understanding, but in human consciousness itself. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, the age of enlightenment, reason and science were supposedly illuminating all the dark corners of human ignorance. But when it came to defining death, when it came to that final threshold, science only made things more complicated, more uncertain, more terrifying. In 1674, in the town of Basingstoke, England, a woman named Alice Blunden took to her bed with a fever. She had been treating herself with poppy water, a tincture of opium widely used for pain and insomnia. But Alice, whether by mistake or intent, consumed far too much. She fell into a deep stupor, unresponsive and barely breathing. Her family, alarmed, called for a physician. The doctor arrived, examined Alice, and pronounced her dead. Her skin was cold. He could detect no pulse, no breath. Her pupils were fixed and dilated. By every criterion available to 17th century medicine, Alice Blunden was deceased. The family, grief-stricken, made arrangements for burial. On July 15, 1674, Alice was interred in the Light, the chapel cemetery at South View in Basingstoke. But 2 days later, on July 17th, children playing near the cemetery heard sounds coming from the ground, muffled thumps and scrapes. The children ran to fetch adults, who came with shovels and dug frantically. They found Alice Blunden's coffin and opened it. The sight inside would haunt Basingstoke for generations. Alice was alive, conscious, and in unspeakable agony. Her fingers were bloody from clawing at the coffin lid. Her face was bruised where she had beaten her head against the wood. Her shroud was torn to shreds. She had been buried alive, had awakened underground, and had spent hours, perhaps a full day or more, trying to escape her wooden prison. The rescuers pulled Alice from the coffin. She could not speak, could not explain what had happened, but her eyes, witnesses said, held in terror beyond description. Physicians were summoned. They examined her and confirmed that she was indeed alive, that she had been in some kind of profound comatose state when buried. But Alice had suffered too much. The trauma, the suffocation, the psychological horror, all had taken their toll. She died within a few hours of being rescued. But here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. The same physician who had declared her dead the first time examined her body again and once more pronounced her dead. The family, traumatized and uncertain, agreed to reburial. And so Alice Blunden, who had already been buried alive once, was placed in a coffin and buried again. And 3 days later, a gravedigger heard sounds from her plot. Sounds of movement, sounds of scraping. But by the time the grave was opened a second time, Alice Blunden was truly dead. Her body, when exhumed, showed fresh bruises, fresh wounds, evidence that she had awakened a second time, that she had fought against her coffin a second time, and that this time there had been no rescue. The town of Basingstoke demanded an investigation. The physician was questioned. The parish authorities conducted an inquiry. In the end, no one was found criminally responsible. The physician had acted according to the medical knowledge of his time. The family had followed established procedures, but Alice Blunden's name became synonymous with premature burial, a cautionary tale told in medical schools and parish churches across England for the next 2 centuries. A blue plaque marks the site today, a memorial to a woman buried alive not once but twice, and her story was far from unique. As the 18th century progressed, reports of premature burial multiplied. Some were documented in medical journals. Others circulated as rumors, growing more elaborate with each retelling. But enough were verified, enough were witnessed by credible sources, that doctors and scientists had to acknowledge a disturbing truth. Medicine could not reliably distinguish between life and death in certain circumstances. The French physician Jacques-Bénin Winslow published a treatise in 1742 titled The Uncertainty of the Signs of Death and the Danger of Precipitate Interments. Winslow documented over 200 cases of premature burial or near burial from across Europe. He described conditions that mimic death: profound syncope or fainting, catalepsy, coma from head injury, poisoning from various substances, and what we would now recognize as various forms of anesthesia or sedation. Winslow's work caused a sensation. Suddenly, the fear that had lurked in the background of European consciousness came roaring into the foreground. If 200 documented cases existed, how many undocumented ones had occurred? How many people had awakened in darkness, had screamed without being heard, had died in terror beneath the ground? The Académie des Sciences in Paris took up the question. They convened panels of physicians to study the problem. They published guidelines for confirming death. And they began to advocate for a waiting period, a delay between declared death and burial, to allow time for any life to reveal itself. But the wealthy and the anxious wanted more than guidelines. They wanted guarantees. And so inventors began to work. The first patents for safety coffins appeared in the mid-18th century. These early designs were crude, little more than coffins with air holes or speaking tubes, but they represented a profound shift in thinking. Death, once considered the ultimate certainty, had become uncertain. And if death was uncertain, then coffins needed to accommodate the possibility that the occupant might wake up. In 1792, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, a German nobleman and military commander, commissioned the first truly elaborate safety coffin. The Duke was obsessed with premature burial, and he spent the last years of his life designing his own tomb. His specifications were meticulous. The coffin must have a window to allow light in. It must have an air tube to provide fresh air. It must have a lock rather than nails, so it could be opened from the inside if necessary. And it must be placed in a vault that could be easily accessed. When Duke Ferdinand died later that year, he was interred exactly as he had wished. His coffin, with its window and air tube, became famous across Europe. Visitors came to see it. Other nobles commissioned similar designs. The race to create the perfect safety coffin had begun. But it was in the 19th century that the fear of premature burial reached its zenith and the bells returned, not as church bells rung at death, but as alarm bells connected to the grave itself. Moving into the 1800s, Europe was transforming. The Industrial Revolution was creating vast new cities. Populations were exploding. And with dense urban living came epidemics: cholera, typhus, yellow fever, influenza. These diseases killed quickly and sometimes in ways that mimicked death before death had actually occurred. Cholera was particularly notorious. The disease, caused by Vibrio cholerae bacteria and spread through contaminated water, struck with terrifying speed. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. The profuse diarrhea and vomiting caused such severe dehydration that victims appeared cadaverous while still alive. Their skin turned grayish-blue. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Their body temperature dropped. Their pulse became almost undetectable. The first cholera pandemic reached Europe in 1831, spreading from India through the Middle East and arriving in England and France by 1832. The disease caused mass panic. Cities established emergency protocols. Bodies were to be buried within 24 hours to prevent contagion. This speed, this indecent haste as it was called in the newspapers, made premature burial almost inevitable. The stories from the cholera epidemics are horrific. In Paris, a man named Jean-Baptiste Guérin collapsed on the Rue Saint-Denis in July of 1832. He was carried to the Hôtel Dieu hospital, where a physician pronounced him dead of cholera. His body was taken to the morgue to await burial, but several hours later, a morgue attendant heard groaning. He investigated and found Guérin conscious, weak but alive. Guérin had been in a cholera-induced coma, so profound that even hospital physicians could not detect life. In London, the weekly medical journal The Lancet began publishing a regular column on premature burial. Between 1832 and 1855, The Lancet documented over 150 verified cases of people declared dead who revived before burial, and another 80 cases where evidence suggested the person had been buried alive. Scratch marks inside coffins, corpses found in positions suggesting struggle, bodies exhumed for relocation that showed signs of post-burial trauma. The medical community was in crisis. If trained physicians in modern hospitals could not reliably detect life, what hope was there for country doctors, for midwives, for parish clerks examining bodies in dim cottages? The uncertainty was maddening, and it drove people to desperate measures. In America, the fear was just as intense. Edgar Allan Poe, the master of Gothic horror, wrote extensively about premature burial. His 1844 short story, The Premature Burial, describes a narrator who suffers from catalepsy and is terrified he will be buried alive during one of his attacks. Poe writes, "To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. That it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen will scarcely be denied by those who think. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?" Poe's fear was not mere literary invention. He suffered from epilepsy and knew that his seizures could be mistaken for death. Other famous Americans shared this terror. George Washington, on his deathbed in December of 1799, made his secretary, Tobias Lear, promise not to let his body be buried for at least 3 days. Washington's final recorded words include, "Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." The father of his country was afraid of premature burial. Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish author of fairy tales, kept a note beside his bed every night that read, "I only seem dead." He instructed friends that before burial, his artery should be cut to ensure death was real. Frédéric Chopin, the Polish composer, made a similar request in his will. He asked that his heart be cut out before burial, certain that only such a drastic measure would prevent premature interment. The 19th century was drowning in this fear. Medical journals debated it. Novels explored it. Newspapers reported on it. And inventors, hundreds of inventors, tried to solve it. The patent offices of Europe and America were flooded with safety coffin designs. The most elaborate, the most famous, The most ingenious of these devices was created by Count Mitchell de Karnaskarnicki, a Russian nobleman and chamberlain to Tsar Nicholas II. In 1897, the Count patented his Locarnus safety coffin, a marvel of late Victorian engineering. The Locarnus system worked like this. A spring-loaded glass ball was placed on the chest of the deceased. If the chest moved, even slightly, the ball would roll, triggering a mechanism. This mechanism would instantly do 4 things simultaneously. First, it would pop open a tube to allow fresh air into the coffin. Second, it would raise a flag 4 feet above the grave. Third, it would ring a bell loud enough to be heard across the cemetery. Fourth, it would light a lamp that would shine through the night. Count Karnaskarnicki demonstrated his invention at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1898. He placed a volunteer in a coffin, covered him with soil, and had him trigger the mechanism. The audience watched as the flag shot up, the bell rang, and the light blazed. The demonstration was a sensation. Newspapers across Europe and America reported on it. Orders poured in. The Locarnus represented the pinnacle of premature burial prevention technology. But here is the tragic irony. Despite hundreds of safety coffins being manufactured and sold, despite elaborate warning systems installed in cemeteries across the world, there is no verified record of any of them ever saving someone buried alive. Not one. The coffins were purchased, installed, and maintained. Cemetery workers were hired specifically to watch for flags and listen for bells. But the bells never rang. The flags never rose. Either the fear was overblown, or by the time these systems were deployed, medical science had advanced enough that premature burial was no longer occurring. Or, and this is the dark possibility that haunted the late Victorians, perhaps the system simply didn't work. Perhaps the awakening person was too weak to trigger the mechanism. Perhaps the mechanisms themselves failed underground, corroded by moisture or clogged with earth. Perhaps the bells did ring, but no one heard, and the ringing eventually stopped as the person died for real. The third chapter takes us deeper into the 19th century, into an age of both advancing medical knowledge and proliferating anxiety. As science offered new hope for avoiding premature burial, it also revealed just how complex the boundary between life and death truly was. In Germany, a movement began that would spread across Europe and profoundly affect death practices. Dr. Christoph Wilhelm Heufeland, a prominent physician in Weimar, published a treatise in 1790 titled The Danger of Premature Burial. Heufeland didn't just describe the problem. He proposed a solution, radical for its time, that would change how death was handled in German-speaking lands. Heufeland advocated for the creation of Leichenhäuser, waiting mortuaries. These were special buildings where the recently deceased would be kept for several days under constant observation. If any sign of life appeared, medical personnel would be immediately available. If no life appeared and decomposition began, then burial could proceed with certainty. The first Leichenhäuser was built in Weimar in 1791. Others quickly followed in Munich, Frankfurt, Berlin, and dozens of smaller cities. These were not grim, utilitarian structures. They were often ornate, designed to ease the minds of grieving families. Large, well-ventilated halls with rows of beds. Bodies were laid out, not in coffins, but on cushioned platforms. They were dressed in comfortable clothing, not shrouds. They were surrounded by flowers. And each body had a string tied to one finger, connected to a bell. If the finger moved, if any muscle twitched, if any sign of life appeared, the bell would ring. Attendants maintained 24-hour vigils, watching and listening. They also monitored for the smell of decomposition, the true sign that death was irreversible. The waiting mortuaries became surprisingly popular. By the mid-19th century, over 100 were operating in German lands alone. France established similar facilities. In Paris, the city morgue, which had primarily served as a place to display unknown dead so they could be identified, also began functioning as a waiting mortuary for those feared to be not fully deceased. But the waiting mortuaries revealed something unexpected. While they prevented premature burial, they also showed just how rarely it actually occurred. Records from the Munich Leichenhäuser, which operated from 1819 to 1934, show that in over 50,000 bodies observed, not a single one revived. Not one. The same was true in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in Weimar. The bells, connected to so many thousands of fingers, stayed silent. This created a paradox. The absence of revivals could mean one of two things. Either medical science had become accurate enough that premature death pronouncement was no longer a significant problem, or the conditions that caused death-like states were rare enough that, given the relatively small sample size, no cases appeared in the waiting mortuaries. The wealthy, unsatisfied with the first explanation and unwilling to trust the second, continued to demand personal preventive measures, and so the safety coffin industry continued to thrive. In 1868, a German inventor named Johann Taberger patented a system that combined a coffin-mounted bell with a ladder and air tube. If the buried person awoke, they could ring the bell. If help didn't arrive immediately, they could climb the ladder to a sealed chamber just below the surface, where air tubes would keep them alive until rescue came. The system cost the modern equivalent of several $1,000s, but wealthy Germans purchased dozens of them. In America, inventors took a different approach. Rather than complex mechanisms, they focused on simple effectiveness. The American safety coffins of the 1870s and 1880s often featured large tubes, sometimes 6 inches in diameter, running from the coffin to the surface. A bell pull ran through the tube. If the person awoke, they simply pulled the rope, and a large bell mounted at the grave would ring. Some versions included speaking tubes so the person could call for help. Others had tubes large enough to pass food and water down. Dr. Johann Nepomuk Eisenbrandt, a Munich physician, conducted a study in 1893 on the effectiveness of various safety coffin designs. He used cadavers to test whether a person in a typical coffin, buried 6 feet deep, would have enough room to move and enough strength to trigger various mechanisms. His findings were sobering. First, once a coffin was buried, the weight of soil made it nearly impossible to open from the inside, even if unlocked. Second, the carbon dioxide that accumulated in a buried coffin would render a person unconscious within minutes, long before most mechanisms could be effectively used. Third, the physical and psychological trauma of waking in a buried coffin would likely prevent coherent action. Eisenbrandt's conclusion: safety coffins might provide psychological comfort to the living, but they offered little real protection to the accidentally buried. Yet the coffins continued to sell, because the fear was real even if the danger was vanishing. And that fear was fed by a steady stream of stories, some true, some exaggerated, all terrifying, about premature burial. In 1885, a story from Massachusetts captured international attention. A man named Timothy Clark Smith, a physician from Middlebury, Vermont, died on Halloween. But Dr. Smith had spent years of his life terrified of premature burial. He had read the medical literature. He knew about catalepsy, about coma, about death-mimicking states, and he had made elaborate arrangements. Dr. Smith's grave at Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, Vermont, is unlike any other. A cement tube runs from his coffin, positioned at his face, straight up through the earth to the surface. At the top of this tube is a square glass window, 14 inches on each side, set into a cement block. The design allowed Dr. Smith's face to be visible from above. If he revived, observers could see him and dig him up. If he remained dead, the glass would fog and eventually, his decomposition would be visible through the window. Today, more than a century later, the window is still there, though condensation has mostly obscured the view. Some visitors claim to see the shadow of a skull through the mist. Whether Dr. Smith ever woke after burial, we'll never know. But his grave stands as a monument to 19th century taphophobia. In Britain, the fear took a different form. The British, with their characteristic emphasis on legislation rather than invention, passed laws designed to prevent premature burial. The Births and Deaths Registration Act of 1836 required that all deaths be certified by a medical professional before burial could occur. The Cemetery Act of 1852 mandated that no burial could take place within 24 hours of death, unless special circumstances existed. But these legal safeguards didn't eliminate the fear, because cases continued to be reported. The British Medical Journal, founded in 1840, regularly published articles on premature burial. Some were scholarly analyses. Others were sensational accounts of near misses or suspected cases. One case particularly haunted Victorian Britain. In 1871, a woman identified only as Mrs. Harcourt of Tonbridge Wells appeared to die of heart failure. Her physician, a doctor, Pettigrew, examined her thoroughly and pronounced her dead. The death certificate was issued. Funeral arrangements were made. Mrs. Harcourt was placed in her coffin, and the coffin was sealed and placed in the family vault. 3 days later, Mrs. Harcourt's sister insisted the vault be opened. She had been troubled by dreams, she said, dreams in which her sister called for help. The family reluctantly agreed. When the vault was opened and the coffin unsealed, they found Mrs. Harcourt's body had moved. Her hands, which had been folded on her chest, were now raised and pressed against the coffin lid. Her face, which had been peaceful, was contorted. The inside of the coffin lid bore scratches, and her fingernails were broken and bloody. An investigation followed. Had Mrs. Harcourt been buried alive? The coroner's jury examined the evidence and returned an open verdict. They could not definitively say whether she had awakened in the coffin, or whether the changes to her body were the result of post-mortem processes. But the scratches, the broken nails, the changed position, all suggested something terrible had occurred. The case sparked renewed calls for longer waiting periods before burial. It inspired a wave of safety coffin purchases. And it reinforced the Victorian obsession with death and its uncertain boundaries. Edgar Allan Poe had died in 1849, but his stories of premature burial continued to influence Victorian culture. Other writers took up the theme. Wilkie Collins wrote about it in The Moonstone. Charles Dickens explored it in Our Mutual Friend. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used it in several Sherlock Holmes stories. Premature burial had become a staple of Gothic and sensation fiction, reflecting and reinforcing public anxiety. Medical education began to change in response. By the 1880s, medical schools across Europe and America were teaching students specifically about the signs of true death. The curriculum included instruction on how to distinguish death from coma, from catalepsy, from profound syncope. Students learned to check for multiple signs: the cessation of heartbeat, the absence of breath, the cooling of the body, the stiffening of rigor mortis, the onset of livor mortis, the pooling of blood, and ultimately the beginning of decomposition. But even medical students were taught to be cautious, to wait, to observe. A textbook from 1891 advises, no physician should pronounce death until at least 6 hours have passed without any sign of life, and unless multiple independent signs of cessation are present. In cases of suspected catalepsy or coma, wait 24 hours. When in doubt, wait for decomposition to begin, as this is the only absolute sign. Yet despite all these precautions, despite the waiting mortuaries and the safety coffins and the careful medical examinations, stories continued to emerge. And as the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began, these stories took on a new character. They became less about preventing premature burial and more about documenting that such things had happened, that they were real, that the fear had always been justified. In 1915, in South Carolina, a woman named Essie Dunbar fell into a coma following an epileptic seizure. A country doctor examined her and pronounced her dead. Given the summer heat and the rural location, arrangements were made for quick burial. Essie was placed in a coffin and taken to the cemetery. But Essie's sister, who lived in a neighboring town, could not arrive in time for the funeral. She sent word asking that the burial be delayed until she could say goodbye. The family agreed, and when the sister arrived several hours later, she asked that the coffin be opened so she could see Essie one last time. The lid was removed. The sister leaned over to kiss Essie's forehead, and Essie Dunbar opened her eyes. She sat up. People screamed. Several fainted. Essie, confused and disoriented, asked what was happening. She had been in a coma so profound that the doctor, using all the diagnostic tools available in rural 1915, could not detect life. Essie Dunbar lived for another 47 years, dying in 1962 at the age of 87. Her case is one of the last well-documented instances of near-premature burial in the United States. Medical science had finally advanced to the point where such mistakes were becoming truly rare. But the fear didn't disappear. Even today, in the 21st century, people still purchase safety coffins. Modern versions include cell phones sealed in waterproof containers, oxygen supplies, and GPS locators. These are not popular, not common, but they exist. The fear, ancient and primal, survives. The fourth chapter moves us into the modern era, the 20th century, when medical science finally conquered the uncertainty that had plagued humanity for millennia. But even as the actual danger of premature burial vanished, its psychological and cultural impact continued to resonate. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, brought death on an unprecedented scale. Millions of soldiers died in trenches, in shell craters, in hospitals. The sheer volume of casualties necessitated rapid burial. Military protocols required that soldiers be buried within 24 hours of death, often faster if the body was near the front lines. This speed reignited premature burial fears. Military medical officers kept detailed records, and these records reveal a surprising truth. Despite the haste, despite the overwhelming numbers, despite the chaotic conditions, there are almost no documented cases of premature burial in the First World War. Why? Because by 1914, medical science had developed reliable techniques for confirming death. The stethoscope, invented in 1816 but not widely used until the late 19th century, allowed physicians to detect even the faintest heartbeat. Blood pressure cuffs could identify circulation that was too subtle for pulse checking to detect. Most importantly, the standardization of medical training meant that even battlefield medics had better diagnostic skills than most civilian physicians had possessed 50 years earlier. But the war did produce one interesting development in premature burial prevention. Gas attacks, which caused victims to collapse in death-like states, led military physicians to insist on longer observation periods for gas casualties. Soldiers exposed to chlorine or mustard gas would sometimes fall into deep comas lasting hours or even days. Military protocols, by 1916, required that all gas casualties be observed for at least 48 hours before death was pronounced. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919, which killed more people than the war itself, brought a brief resurgence of premature burial fears. The disease killed so quickly, and so many died, that overwhelmed doctors and undertakers sometimes made mistakes. But these were increasingly rare, and when they occurred, the person almost always revived before burial rather than after. By the 1920s and 1930s, premature burial had ceased to be a legitimate medical concern in the developed world. The rise of hospitals, where death increasingly occurred under medical supervision, meant that fewer people died at home where mistakes could happen. The development of electrocardiograms, EKG, which could definitively detect heart activity, provided absolute certainty. The professionalization of undertaking, with embalming becoming standard practice, meant that anyone not truly dead would certainly revive during the embalming process. The safety coffin industry, which had thrived for over a century, collapsed. By 1930, manufacturers were going out of business. Patents for new designs ceased. The elaborate grave bells and warning systems were removed from cemeteries or left to rust and decay. The waiting mortuaries in Germany closed one by one, the last shuttering in the late 1930s. But if the real danger had passed, why do we still remember? Why does the fear persist in our collective consciousness? The answer lies in what the fear of premature burial represented. It was never really about being buried alive, not at the deepest level. It was about losing control. It was about the medical establishment's power over our bodies. It was about the terrifying moment when we pass from person to corpse, and whether we have any say in that transition. In literature and film, premature burial remained a powerful trope. Alfred Hitchcock used it in his 1960 film Psycho, though obliquely. Stephen King explored it in multiple novels, most directly in a short story titled The Doctor's Case. In the 1990 film Flatliners, medical students deliberately stop their hearts to experience death, then revive themselves, playing with the boundary that had terrified their ancestors. The modern incarnation of taphophobia manifests differently. People don't fear being buried alive so much as they fear being declared brain dead when they're not, or being pronounced dead in the emergency room when some spark of consciousness remains. The fear has adapted to modern medical contexts, but the core anxiety remains. What if I'm still here, still aware, but no one knows? There are documented cases, extremely rare but real, of people being declared dead in hospitals who later revived in morgues. These cases, investigated thoroughly by medical review boards, almost always involve massive system failures, misread monitors, clerical errors, or catastrophic lapses in protocol. They don't happen because death is uncertain. They happen because humans make mistakes. In Japan, waiting mortuaries made a brief comeback in the 1950s and 60s, not because premature burial was a concern, but because Buddhist funeral customs required bodies to be kept for several days. These facilities served a religious and cultural purpose rather than a medical one. In isolated parts of the world, where access to modern medical care is limited, premature burial likely still occasionally occurs. But even in rural areas of developing countries, traditional practices that involve extended wakes and observation periods provide protection against such mistakes. In the developed world, the last legitimate concern about premature burial effectively ended with the widespread adoption of brain death criteria in the 1970s and 80s. Once physicians could definitively measure brain activity or its absence using EEGs and other neurological tests, there was no longer any question. Death could be determined with absolute certainty. But here's a curious fact. Despite all the centuries of fear, despite all the safety coffins and grave bells, despite all the elaborate precautions, we have surprisingly little evidence about how often premature burial actually occurred. We have the stories, hundreds of them. We have the scratches on coffin lids, the bodies found in positions of struggle. But we don't have reliable statistics. Historians estimate, based on fragmentary evidence, that perhaps 1 in every 10,000 burials before 1800 involved someone not fully dead. That's a tiny percentage, but applied to centuries of burials across Europe and America, it translates to thousands of people. Thousands of people who woke in darkness, who breathed their last breaths in coffins, who died in terror beneath the earth. And even if the actual rate was lower, even if the fear was disproportionate to the danger, it shaped civilization. It changed medicine. It altered burial practices. It inspired inventions. It influenced law and culture and religion. The fear of premature burial helped create modern medical death determination standards. It led to the professionalization of undertaking. It contributed to the development of intensive care medicine, where the line between life and death is carefully monitored. As we approach the modern age, as we move into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the story of premature burial becomes the story of how humanity conquered one of its deepest fears through science and reason, but also how that fear, even conquered, continues to echo in our culture and our consciousness. The 5th chapter brings us to the contemporary period, to the 21st century, where the terror of premature burial has finally, truly ended as a medical reality, but persists as a cultural memory and a psychological phenomenon. Today, premature burial in the developed world is medically impossible, not merely unlikely. Modern death determination protocols are exhaustive and certain. When someone appears to die in a hospital, multiple criteria must be met before death is pronounced. The heart must have ceased beating, verified by continuous monitoring. Breathing must have stopped, confirmed by lack of chest movement and absence of air movement through the airway. Brain activity must have ceased, verified by the absence of neurological reflexes, and in questionable cases, by electroencephalogram. For organ donation cases, where absolute certainty is critical, even more stringent standards apply. Brain death must be confirmed by 2 independent physicians using a battery of tests. The apnea test, which verifies that the patient cannot breathe independently, must be performed. Blood flow to the brain must be assessed. Only after all these criteria are met, and confirmed twice with a time interval between confirmations, can death be declared. In this environment, the idea of being buried alive is no longer a realistic fear, but the fear itself hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. Modern taphophobia manifests as anxiety about being declared dead prematurely, about organ donation proceeding while some consciousness remains, about pulling the plug on life support when recovery might still be possible. These modern fears are different from historical taphophobia in one crucial way. They're fears about the definition of death, not about the detection of death. In the past, people feared that doctors couldn't tell if they were dead. Today, people fear that the medical definition of death might not align with their own beliefs about when life truly ends. The case of Terry Schiavo in 2005 brought these anxieties into sharp focus. Schiavo had been in a persistent vegetative state for 15 years. Medical examinations showed that her cerebral cortex, the part of the brain responsible for consciousness, had largely liquefied. Yet her family insisted she was still alive in some meaningful sense, still aware, still deserving of life support. The case went through numerous court proceedings before life support was finally withdrawn. The autopsy confirmed that her cerebral cortex was indeed destroyed and that consciousness had been impossible. But for millions of people watching the case unfold, the question remained: how can we be absolutely certain? This is the modern incarnation of the premature burial fear, not a fear of being conscious in a coffin, but a fear of being conscious in a body that appears unconscious, unable to communicate, trapped in what some call locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome, a rare neurological condition where a person is conscious but completely paralyzed except for eye movements, represents the closest modern equivalent to premature burial. The person is fully aware, fully conscious, but trapped in an unresponsive body. Before modern brain imaging and eye-tracking technology, some locked-in patients were misdiagnosed as being in vegetative states. They were conscious but couldn't communicate. They could hear doctors and family members discussing their absence of awareness while being fully present. Technology has now largely solved this problem. Functional MRI can detect consciousness even in completely unresponsive patients. Eye-tracking devices can establish communication even when no other movement is possible. But the brief period in the late 20th century when locked-in syndrome patients were sometimes misdiagnosed created a new chapter in the long history of premature burial fears. In popular culture, the fascination with premature burial continues. The 2010 film, Buried, starring Ryan Reynolds, depicted a civilian contractor in Iraq who wakes up buried alive in a coffin. The entire film takes place in the coffin, exploring the psychological and physical horror of the situation. The film was financially successful and critically acclaimed, demonstrating that the ancient fear still resonates with modern audiences. Books about premature burial continue to be published. Jan Bondessen's Buried Alive, The Terrifying History of Our Most Primal Fear, appeared in 2001. Joanna Ebenstein's The Anatomical Venus explored historical anatomical models, including models demonstrating death verification techniques designed to prevent premature burial. These books find readers, audiences still drawn to the subject. Why does this fear persist when the danger has vanished? Psychologists suggest several reasons. First, it taps into claustrophobia, one of the most common phobias. The idea of being trapped in a small, dark space triggers primal panic responses. Second, it represents a loss of control over one's own life and death, a fear that resonates in an age where medical technology often makes decisions about life and death that would have been left to nature in previous eras. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the fear of premature burial is really a fear of death itself. Death is the ultimate unknown, the one experience we cannot rehearse or prepare for. Premature burial represents a nightmare version of death, where consciousness continues in the worst possible circumstances. It's death without the peace we hope for, without the release we expect. It's death as torture rather than rest. In the 21st century, a handful of companies still manufacture and sell safety coffins. These are marketed primarily to people with severe taphophobia, though some survivalists also purchase them. Modern safety coffins bear little resemblance to their Victorian predecessors. They include cell phones or satellite phones sealed in waterproof containers, oxygen supplies that can last for hours, GPS locators, and sometimes even small explosives that can blow the coffin open. One Italian company sells a coffin with a defibrillator built into the lid, reasoning that if someone wakes up buried, the shock of realization might cause cardiac arrest, and the defibrillator could restart their heart. These modern devices are expensive, costing tens of thousands of dollars, and sales are minimal. But they exist, proving that even in an age of certain death determination, the fear lives on. Several American states have laws specifically requiring that certain measures be taken before burial to ensure death, though these laws are largely symbolic. Embalming, now standard practice in the United States, makes premature burial impossible, as anyone not actually dead would certainly die during the embalming process. In parts of Europe where embalming is less common, other safeguards exist. Germany still requires a waiting period of at least 48 hours between death and burial, a vestige of the old waiting mortuary system. France requires a medical doctor to personally verify death within 24 hours of burial, with specific tests that must be performed and documented. Orthodox Jewish burial customs, which require burial within 24 hours and forbid embalming, have their own safeguards built into tradition. The shomer, the guardian who stays with the body from death until burial, serves partially as protection against premature burial. If any sign of life appears, the shomer will see it and summon help. Muslim burial practices, similarly requiring quick burial without embalming, rely on the washing of the body, the ghusl. During this ritual preparation, any sign of life would be immediately apparent to those performing the washing. These religious practices, developed over centuries, incorporate premature burial protections so seamlessly that followers often don't realize that's part of their purpose. The customs serve spiritual and community functions, yes, but they also serve the ancient practical function of ensuring the dead are truly dead. In the developing world, particularly in rural areas without reliable access to health care, the possibility of premature burial still exists, though likely rarely. Traditional practices that involve waking the dead, community vigils, and waiting periods before burial provide some protection. But without medical confirmation of death, without modern death determination technology, the ancient uncertainty persists. Global health organizations recommend that even in areas without access to physicians, certain signs should be checked before burial. The World Health Organization publishes guidelines suggesting that bodies should show multiple signs of death: absence of heartbeat, absence of breathing, fixed and dilated pupils, and preferably the onset of rigor mortis or signs of decomposition. These guidelines acknowledge that in much of the world, death must still be determined by observation rather than technology. Climate change has introduced an unexpected complication. Heat waves that cause mass casualties sometimes overwhelm morgue and burial systems, leading to rapid burial of victims. Public health officials have expressed concern that in such situations, the safeguards that normally prevent premature burial might be bypassed. After heat waves in France in 2003 and in India in 2015, there were unconfirmed reports of people being prepared for cremation who suddenly revived. These reports were investigated but could not be definitively verified. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brought a brief resurgence of premature burial fears. Early in the pandemic, when little was known about the disease and hospitals were overwhelmed, some patients were declared dead who later revived. These cases, heavily reported in media, actually had more to do with clerical errors and overwhelmed systems than with medical uncertainty about death. In every verified case, the patient was never actually dead, but paperwork errors led to them being transported to morgues or funeral homes while still alive. The errors were caught before burial or cremation, and protocols were quickly improved. But the pandemic did demonstrate that premature burial fears can flare up quickly when systems are stressed, and when death becomes commonplace enough that individuals might be lost in the statistics. The psychological impact of mass death, of overwhelmed morgues, of refrigerator trucks serving as temporary body storage. All these images echoed the plague years and the cholera epidemics of the past. As we move through the 21st century, the story of premature burial becomes the story of how humanity has conquered a fear that once seemed unconquerable. We have replaced uncertainty with certainty, replaced anxiety with confidence. We have developed tools and technologies and protocols that make premature burial effectively impossible in modern medical settings. But we have also lost something in that conquest. We've lost the traditions that grew up around death verification, the extended wakes, the community vigils, the rituals that allowed the living to be absolutely certain before saying goodbye. Modern death often happens in hospitals, behind closed doors, witnessed by strangers in scrubs rather than by family and community. We trust the monitors, the printouts, the medical pronouncements, and we should because they're reliable. But there's a reason that even today, even with all our technological certainty, we still sometimes say, "I want to see the body." There's a reason that open casket funerals persist, that we feel a need to view the deceased one last time. We're still at some level checking. We're still making sure. We're still carrying out that ancient responsibility that our ancestors took so seriously, verifying that death has truly come. The bells that once hung above graves, waiting to be rung by the mistakenly buried, are silent now, rusted, removed, forgotten. The safety coffins that filled Victorian cemeteries have rotted away or been cleared out. The waiting mortuaries have been demolished or converted to other purposes. The elaborate patents and inventions and precautions have been consigned to history, but the memory remains. The fear, conquered but not forgotten, persists in our stories, our nightmares, our culture. We make movies about it. We write novels about it. We tell ghost stories about it. Because even though we know, rationally and scientifically, that premature burial no longer happens, some part of us, some ancient primal part, still fears the darkness beneath the earth and the possibility that we might wake there. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep listening to this story, you might think about all those people across the centuries who feared the same darkness. You might think about the inventors and doctors who tried to solve an unsolvable problem. You might think about the patients who woke in coffins, about the scratches they left behind, about their final terrified moments. But you can also rest easy in the knowledge that we have finally, truly, conquered this ancient terror. Medical science has given us certainty where our ancestors had only doubt. Technology has provided answers where once there were only guesses. The bells are silent because they're no longer needed. And yet, somewhere in the back of your mind, as sleep comes, you might wonder, what if? What if all our certainty is misplaced? What if consciousness continues in ways we can't detect? What if death is not the clear boundary we've convinced ourselves it is? These are the questions that haunted our ancestors. These are the fears that drove them to invention and regulation and ritual. And in the quiet moments in the still of night, they still haunt us too. The story continues, as all stories about death must, without true ending. Because as long as humans live and die, as long as we must cross that threshold from life to whatever comes after, we will wonder about the journey. We will question the boundary. We will fear the possibility that we might be aware in that moment when others believe us gone. The black death bells rang out across medieval Europe, marking the passing of millions. The safety coffin bells waited in Victorian cemeteries, ready to ring warnings that never came. The church bells still toll for the dead, maintaining traditions centuries old. But the grave bells, the warning bells, the alarm bells for those accidentally buried, those have finally fallen silent. In that silence, there is both peace and melancholy. Peace because it means we have solved the problem. Melancholy because those bells represented hope, the hope that even in the grave, salvation might still be possible, that even in the earth, someone might still hear our call. Rest well, sleep deeply, and trust that when your time comes, whenever that may be, centuries from now or decades or tomorrow, you will not wake in darkness beneath the ground. The ancient terror has been conquered. The bells that never rang have finally taught us how to know with certainty when life has ended and death has truly come.